Let's dive deep into Guiguzi. I am fascinated by the sources you found for this one.
Oh, it's a treasure trove.
Yeah, we've got the usual suspects like Wikipedia and a deep dive from ChinaKnowledge.de.
But then we've also got these excerpts about his disciples.
This is going to be good. So today's mission, unearthing Guiguzi, figuring out who he was, his place in history.
And of course, the big question, why his teachings still matter today.
Absolutely. And, right off the bat, his name, Guiguzi, Sage of Ghost Valley, it just screams mystery.
Right. It hints at someone with this really unique wisdom.
Yeah, like he's not your average philosopher.
Not at all.
So let's get down to the basics. We're in ancient China, right?
Right.
But who was this guy? Was he an actual person? Legend? What's the story?
That's where the intrigue starts. There's debate about his actual existence, but some scholars put him in the 4th century BC.
Okay, so that's the Warring States period, right?
Exactly. A time of huge political rivalry, tons of upheaval in China.
And that period was a real breeding ground for ideas, wasn't it? Like you had Confucianism, Taoism emerging then.
Right. And later on, Buddhism also started to gain traction.
But Guiguzi, he's different. He's not about moral codes or finding enlightenment, is he?
Not in the traditional sense. See, those philosophies focused on personal ethics, societal harmony.
Right.
Guiguzi's teachings, they went in a whole other direction. Strategic thinking, persuasion, the art of power, that was his focus.
So more like a political strategist then, like way ahead of his time, almost a precursor to Machiavelli's The Prince, but centuries earlier.
That's a brilliant comparison. Guiguzi's actually often considered the founder of the school of diplomacy.
Zhong Hengjie.
That's the one. He believed in understanding human nature, mastering rhetoric.
Using those skills to navigate the power struggles of the time.
Exactly.
Which kind of explains why his teachings were sometimes banned, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, imagine you're a ruler and your subjects suddenly start learning how to persuade and strategize. It's a little unsettling.
It'd be pretty disruptive, right? Guiguzi's work gave people tools that could challenge the established order.
So no wonder some people saw him as a threat.
Definitely.
So we've got this enigmatic figure in a world of warring states teaching people how to gain influence and power. And then to top it all off, he's got this incredible group of disciples who actually put his teachings into practice.
And those stories are more than just dramatic, They really showcase how Guiguzi's principles could be applied in so many different areas, both in war and diplomacy.
Right, right.
And two of the most famous examples, Sun Bin and Peng Wan, brilliant military strategists, both of them.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those guys. They were rivals, right? Didn't one of them betray the other?
Absolutely. It's a classic example of Guiguzi's teachings taken maybe a bit too far. Peng Wan tricked Sun Bin out of jealousy, which led to Sun Bin being punished and exiled.
Brutal. So how does Sun Bin get his revenge?
Well, eventually he becomes a key advisor to the state of Qi, a military advisor. And at the Battle of Maling, he uses all that strategic brilliance he learned from Guiguzi to just crush Peng Han.
Wow.
It's a story that's captivated people for centuries.
I can see why. So we've got the warfare side of things covered.
Mm-hmm.
But what about those political diplomats you mentioned? How did they use Guiguzi's teachings?
Yes. Those would be Su Qin and Zhang Yi, masters of navigating those alliances and rivalries.
Oh, during the Warring States period, right.
Yep. Applying Guiguzi's principles on a grand scale. Political maneuvering, diplomacy, you name it.
So like ancient spin doctors, shaping the entire political landscape with their words and strategy.
You could definitely say that. Su Qin was a big proponent of vertical alliances, trying to unite multiple states against a common enemy.
Okay.
While Zhang Yi, he advocated for horizontal alliances, aligning with the strongest state, Qin, for strategic advantage, and they were both incredibly successful.
Wow.
Rose to positions of real power through their understanding of persuasion and strategic thinking. It's pretty remarkable.
It's wild to think that these ancient lessons in strategy and diplomacy could still be relevant today.
Oh, they are. Trust me.
But before we get into that, I'm curious about the Guiguzi text itself. What's actually in it? Is it like a manual for gaining power?
Well, the book is divided into 3 parts. The first 2, they really dive into those core teachings we've been talking about.
Observation, persuasion, strategy.
All of that, with chapters that have these really intriguing titles, things like Open Shut, Reflect, Respond, Men Break.
They sound more like cryptic riddles than chapter titles. What do they actually mean?
Well, they give you a glimpse into just how nuanced Guiguzi's thinking was. It wasn't always straightforward, sometimes even counterintuitive. Take Open Shut, for example. It's not about actual doors, it's about strategic timing.
Okay.
Knowing when to reveal your plans, when to stay silent, how to control information,
So keeping people in suspense.
Yes.
Choosing the right moment to strike.
Exactly. And then you've got reflect, respond. This one emphasizes understanding your audience, mirroring their emotions, validating their perspective before you even present your own ideas.
So you're building trust, building that connection before you try to influence them.
That's the idea. It's almost like a psychological game in a way.
Yeah, it is. Figuring out people's motivations, tailoring your approach.
That's the core of Guiguzi's teachings. He knew that real persuasion, it's not about force.
Right.
It's about understanding human nature, adapting to it.
So it's more about strategy.
Exactly. He even has a chapter called Mend Break.
Mend break.
Yeah, it's about exploiting weaknesses, finding the cracks in your opponent's armor, and using them to your advantage.
That's pretty ruthless.
It is. It highlights that pragmatic, almost Machiavellian side of Guiguzi. He wasn't afraid to look at the darker parts of human nature.
And how those could be used strategically.
Exactly. And it brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the whole ethical questions surrounding his teachings.
Right. They're powerful tools, but they can be used for good or bad.
Exactly. Like his disciples. Sun Bin used his knowledge to defend himself and his state.
Right.
Pang Wan, he was driven by jealousy and ambition. Look where that got him.
Yeah. Ultimately, it was his downfall.
It's a reminder that power without wisdom, without ethics, it can be a dangerous thing.
Definitely a cautionary tale there.
And that duality, you actually see it reflected in the third part of the Guiguzi text.
Oh, how so?
Well, some scholars think those chapters, titles like Yin Mystique, Holding the Pivot,
Right.
they might have been added later, maybe even influenced by Taoist thought.
So it's like there are two sides to Guiguzi, the strategic mastermind and the spiritual sage.
That's a great way to put it. And it leaves us with a really interesting question.
Which is,
How do we reconcile those seemingly contradictory sides of his teachings?
that's what I keep coming back to as we go through all of this. You have these incredibly insightful techniques for persuasion and strategy.
Right.
But then you have these warnings about ambition and manipulation.
It all comes down to this. How do we apply Guiguzi's wisdom to our lives today? The world's just as complex and challenging as it was back then, maybe even more so.
You know what really struck me when I was looking at these sources?
What's that?
How incredibly relevant his ideas still feel, especially when it comes to diplomacy, international relations, all the tension in the world, the shifting alliances. It's like Guiguzi's playbook is being used right in front of us.
I completely agree. Just look at all the conflicts and diplomatic standoffs we see every day. Being able to understand your opponent, anticipate their moves, persuasion and influence without resorting to force.
Right.
Those are vital skills in today's world.
And not just on a global scale, right?
Yeah.
I bet these principles could be applied in everyday life.
Absolutely. Negotiations, business, even personal relationships. Guiguzi's emphasis on observation, understanding people's motivations, adapting your approach, those are valuable tools for anyone.
But then there's that ethical question again. How do we make sure we use this knowledge for good? We've seen how it can be twisted.
That is the key question. It comes down to each person making a conscious choice. We have to be mindful of the consequences of our actions, always trying to use this understanding of human nature for good.
It's a challenge, but a worthwhile one.
It is.
And it's something I'm definitely thinking about as we dive into those chapter titles in the Guiguzi text. They're so fascinating.
I really are. They offer such a unique perspective on that tactical side of his teachings, a framework for thinking about persuasion and influence in a strategic and ethical way.
Okay, so let's unpack some of those chapter titles, those cryptic ones. We were talking about open, shut, and reflect, respond.
It's like they're martial arts moves or something.
Right, so open, shut, that one really stuck with me.
It's all about controlling information. Think about it. If you lay all your cards on the table right away...
You lose your leverage.
Exactly. You have to create that air of mystery.
Keep them guessing.
Right, and choose the perfect moment to reveal your true intentions. It's like a high-stakes poker game. You don't want to tip your hand too early.
No, you don't.
And it's not just about holding back. It's also knowing when to open up, when to share just enough.
To build trust or pique their interest.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance.
It is. What about reflect, respond? How does that play out in real life?
Okay, imagine you're trying to win someone over and they're totally resistant to your ideas. Instead of arguing, you reflect their concerns back to them, you acknowledge their feelings, you basically show them.
You get it?
Right. You get where they're coming from, and then you present your perspective. It's about building that empathy.
creating a connection first.
Exactly. And that's something we often forget these days with all the fast-paced communication and heated debates.
Yeah, we jump right into arguing.
We do, without really listening, without trying to see the other side.
Guiguzi reminding us to slow down.
He is. But he wasn't all about subtlety and finesse, was he?
No, definitely not. What about men break? That one's a bit more aggressive, right?
Ah, yes, men break. That's where Guiguzi says, look, sometimes you need a more direct approach. It's about finding those weaknesses, those pressure points.
And using them to your advantage.
Right. It's definitely got that Machiavellian edge. But, in that world of warring states, diplomacy and gentle persuasion, they didn't always cut it.
Right. You had to be strategic to survive.
You did. And even today, there are times when you need that more assertive approach.
Like in a tough negotiation.
Exactly. Or when you're fighting for something you really believe in. You have to know how to apply pressure strategically to achieve your goals. It's a reminder that power and influence, they can be used in many ways. And ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide how we'll wield them.
So, after this deep dive into Guiguzi, what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key message is this. Guiguzi's teachings aren't about good versus evil or right versus wrong.
Okay.
They're about understanding how people interact, the dynamics of power and influence, and then using that knowledge wisely and ethically.
It's been an incredible journey exploring Guiguzi, from uncovering the mystery of who he was to unraveling his complex teachings, and of course wrestling with those ethical questions. Always the ethical questions.
Right. But his wisdom, it still speaks to us today, even after all these centuries.
It does. Whether we're navigating a tricky negotiation, trying to persuade someone, or just trying to understand the world around us, Guiguzi's insights are timeless. They give us a framework for thinking about power, influence, and the art of persuasion.
That's what I love about these deep dives. We get to connect with these ancient thinkers.
And discover how their ideas can still guide us today.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the world of knowledge.